Okay. Alrighty. Can we include that? Count, make a moment. Hi, my name is Tizneem Jiancaro. I'm a researcher with the Episodic Disability and Rehab Lab at the University of Toronto. And today I'm talking about loving them or leaving them. And when, of course, I'm talking about our fitness trackers. So I'll just go through a few basics today with you on that. What are fitness trackers, different classifications, and then in keeping with this theme, I'll mention a little bit about our consumer desire for fitness trackers, a potential love, a potential letdown, and the final reveal. So let's get going. The basics. So there are three categories of consumer fitness trackers or wearables. The first is actually fitness trackers. Now, I'd like to show you an example of one. And this one, if you can see it, is a Fitbit. So this is a basic fitness tracker, and it's a fitness tracker because its focus is health and fitness, health and well-being. So the functionality all relates to that. So it includes for motion, for example, there'll be mechanisms in there like an accelerometer or gyroscope. For elevation, to sense elevation, there'll be a barometer or an altimeter. To sense something like heart rate, there would be something called a PPG monitor. So what I'll do right now is just take this Fitbit and put it up to the camera, and maybe you'll be able to see a green flashing light. So that green flashing light, that's what is in contact with the skin in order to measure heart rate. Some trackers have more sophisticated mechanisms inside for EEG, even for VO2 max measures. So, but the whole gist of fitness trackers is that they focus on health and well-being. In the next category are sports watches. These are very niche. So they're dedicated to a particular sport. So if you're a swimmer, you might want a dedicated swim watch. If you do triathlons, there are watches specific to triathlons. As it turns out, there are watches specific to golf and even for kiteboarding. So very niche area. A much broader area are the classification of smartwatches. And what they are, they include the health and fitness and well-being functions and apps, but they include other apps, so non-health related apps. So if you're someone who wants to stream music while working out, a smartwatch might be an option for you. Now, regardless, all of these are run by proprietary algorithms. The algorithms do get updated regularly, but they are proprietary. So we don't exactly know what happens as consumers or as researchers with that because they're kind of under the hood. So that's kind of the basics. Let's take a look at a little bit about, we'll say, the consumer desire for smartwatches. And so I'll just mention that the smartwatch uptake is mirroring early mobile phone uptake. So according to The Economist in 2022, here's our smartwatch uptake where we're at right now. And so that's quite a slope that is quite steep. Early mobile phone use was quite steep as well in a similar way. So that kind of suggests that we're on the upswing for smartwatches. The Economist is also reporting that in 2021, 1 in 4 Americans had a smartwatch. So that's a little bit about how rapid uptake is going. And it suggests too that there's a certain love of these kinds of devices. So a recent article from the Globe and Mail, a Fitbit keeps my 90-something mom motivated and moving. And this kind of article is kind of ubiquitous now. We see it everywhere. One of the other things, though, that this writer commented on was that the Fitbit seems an appropriate metaphor for life these days because counting is de rigueur. And I don't know about you, but I think to myself, we've been seeing COVID case counts every day. So we're doing a lot of counting. We count cases, we count days in self-isolation, we count calories. In the Department of Physical Therapy, they count the number of minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise in keeping with physical activity guidelines. So there's a lot of counting. So that brings us to the idea of quantifying the self. The quantified self was a term that was raised by Gary Wolfe in 2007 when he worked with Wired magazine. And the quantified self is now an organization that includes users and technology developers. And they have the tagline, self-knowledge through numbers. So, what did the Economist have to say about this? Well, they're saying that, because of this quantified self notion, people are seeing into themselves in ways not possible before and are finding new ways to act on what they learn. And in fact, the effect on health and lifestyle is likely to be profound. So, profound in what ways exactly? Well, the Economist goes on to say it's making life more medicalized on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a shift in the balance of responsibility between clinicians and patients. So, what does this mean in the context of HIV? Well, there was a scoping review done from a team in the physical therapy department at the University of Toronto, and they looked at 25 articles. They published it in 2019, I believe, and they were looking at the question, what is the nature and extent of evidence pertaining to wearables and their use? And what they found were a few gaps in the research, one related to validity and reliability, another to effectiveness. Did this actually work to improve physical activity? And the third, inquiring into what exactly is the role of wearables? Is it more on the quantification side, or is there potential for motivation? On the topic of validity and reliability, a recent review in 2020 looked at step count, heart rate, and energy expenditure. And what did they find? Well, they looked at 158 publications and examined 9 different wearable brands. And when it came to step count in the lab, they found that all the brands actually appeared to measure steps fairly accurately. In terms of heart rate, Apple and Garmin were more accurate. In terms of energy expenditure, no brand was accurate. So when you have these devices and they tell you how many calories you burned, it may or may not be accurate. Now, the one key is that these are lab based results, and there were not very many community-based studies, although there were some, but fairly few at the time. The other issue about this is that most of the devices were actually out of the market by the time the article was published. So it's unfortunate, but it is suggestive of the lag between market development and activity and then the research kind of speed. So this is a common thing, and I think there might be ways for researchers to think about how to match or improve the speed of knowledge translation when it comes to these kinds of devices. The other issue that comes up with this kind of measurement is that the algorithms are all changing because every time a device gets updated, the algorithm may possibly be updated, but they're all proprietary. So researchers, consumers would not know. So looking at effectiveness, I believe also in 2021 was a systematic review, and this one involved 28 randomized controlled trials involving adults without a chronic disease and 28% of women, what they found was a small, moderate positive effect on physical activity. And as well, in subgroup analysis, they also found that behavior change techniques were significant. One of their comments was that it remains unclear what the right dose of app or tracker usage may be, or how it might vary from person to person or depending on the circumstance. So this is actually a really key point because it's such a common problem in implementation science. So it goes back to that really big question in implementation science: what works for who, under what circumstances, to change what behavior and how? And it's such a challenging question to answer. When it comes to quantification or motivation, simply wearing a device tracker may not offer an advantage over standard behavioral approaches. So that comes from a recent article from the Canadian Journal of Cardiology. In a similar vein, an article from The Conversation, and this is from 3 researchers. I believe they're American kinesiologists, and you just need to look at really the headline. A boom in fitness trackers is not leading to a boom in physical activity among individuals in developed countries who are all moving less. And so they had a suggestion, and that is that measurement is a good first step, but increasing activity requires something else, and it will require components like goal setting, like self-monitoring, like positive feedback, like social support. So, well, should we leave these devices? There are concerns, and the concerns relate to privacy and surveillance and to digital inequity. And there are other concerns for users, particularly the issue of overtraining, the issue of sacrificing quality for quantity. This might impact a person's form. Do they still keep a good form while they're doing their exercises? And finally, overriding that sense of felt experience. So it's basically not listening to your body. But it's these first 2 that I've listed that I'd just like to touch on. So the first one is to remember that this is actually a business. I mean, we wear our fitness tracker, but it's also the case that, for example, Fitbit was bought up by Google around 2019, 2020. And what does that mean? Well, the consequences are that health data for Fitbit has on its users at that time would become Google's data. So that was a couple of years ago when the deal went through. And more recently, here's Tech Radar saying, well, it'll be interesting to see how else Google can work Fitbit tech into its other devices. And that's because Fitbit is now integrated with Google Nest. So just because you believe that your data is private today, it does not guarantee that your data will be private tomorrow. Looking more deeply at this question of privacy, and particularly mobile health and privacy. Now, often when I, for example, put on my own Fitbit, I don't particularly think, oh, this is connected to an app, but this is connected to an app. And that means that I'm also connected to a tech giant's ecosystem. So in the case of Fitbit, it would be the Google ecosystem. So in this article, what they did is they looked at mobile health apps from Google Play, and they did a few different kinds of technical analyses. And this is a group of computer scientists and health informatics specialists from Australia. And so they found, for example, that shockingly, 88% of these mobile health apps on Google Play could access and potentially share personal data. And that includes, if I recall, approximately 1/3 of them had access to email addresses that could be shared, and 1/4 of them had access to geolocation data. The other finding was that data collection often exceeded what is publicly disclosed by app developers. Continuing on this theme is an editorial in the British Medical Journal, And what they did, again, you just look at the title. Health apps are designed to track and share. And we don't always think about that when, we strap on a Fitbit. The advice for consumers was to check their settings and adjust them, use ad blockers. The recommendation for policymakers was to advocate for greater scrutiny, regulation, and accountability, and to address whether these data should exist, how they should be used, and to ensure accountability for harms that arise. Now, that brings me to another topic, which is digital inequity. And here in Canada, it's been reported that 1/4 of Indigenous communities have access to broadband internet compared to 97% in urban Canadian households. Also, that even access to the internet sharply declines for older Canadians, and that even despite that, access to the internet doesn't even translate to adoption. This was all published in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology, and it points to some serious concerns. Now, where does that leave us? Should we love them or leave them? Well, certainly there's a potential for improved physical activity, especially when we combine them with behavior change techniques. On the other hand, there are drawbacks. And those drawbacks, as I said, relate to privacy and surveillance, relate to digital inequity. So there are parts to love, there are parts to leave. And I'll leave you with this, that you can't quantify everything a player does to win.